I'm going to invite Dr. Ben Whitburn to join us for a few closing observations. Welcome, Ben. I'm going to quickly read out an introduction for you so everybody who's with us knows who you are. So this is Dr. Ben Whitburn, Associate Professor here at the University of Southampton. Ben is a disabled scholar of disability studies applied broadly to the field of education. Ben currently holds the role of Associate Professor at Southampton in Southampton Education School. His research and teaching has inevitably ventured into matters related to accessibility, as much a digital and physical concern as a cultural one, and invariably much more important to those who have it compromised. Ben applies conceptual innovations to this area of scholarship to emphasise what can be learned from disability. So Ben, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everybody, for holding on for such a long day and such an interesting day. And to think back that we've heard roughly 12 to 15 presenters today. Hats off to the organisers and to everyone who has spoken. To set some context of what's around me, I am a user of Braille and a screen reader. And you know, to witness the massive increase of technology as we go along, I now have a Braille, refreshable Braille display, something that David, I think, would be very familiar with, the Focus 40 Blue. I have an embosser, a Braille embosser. I have the latest copy of JAWS for Windows, Job Access with Speech for Windows, screen reader, and I have an iPhone. And yet, I am still plagued with inaccessible environments on an almost daily basis in my role. And I'm a non-mouse user, and that could be partly one of the things that is quite daunting for many. Not so much for those in the room, I'm sure. What I'd like to draw attention to today is the lived experience of some of the things that we've been hearing about. And I will make the point that I have given you a plethora of the sorts of things that I'll be using today. You'll probably hear my screen reader as I get to the points that I didn't have time to braille up. I won't be universalizing this. I'm not speaking for others who have other access needs. Before I do go on, I'd like to express my thanks and admiration to the community who sits here in the room. Those of you whose efforts are in support of increasing practical knowledge of accessibility internationally, and thanks to those who've come before me as well. So there are more people like me in universities today, more so as students and less so as academics. But of course, we should never stop trying to build that further and thinking about how we're nowhere near the 20% of the population, roughly, who has a disability. And accessibility, I often explain it to people like this. It's something that is an issue for people who don't have it by default, and yet it's something that's really significant to those of us disabled and non-disabled alike, so that we can do our jobs. People use a screen so they can see what is on their computer, of course. Now, invariably, accessibility is understood legally as a reasonable adjustment and identified for people with disabilities as something that is beyond what they would typically get if only they'll disclose the reasons for needing it. I'd also point to I think quite an erroneous way of thinking about accessibility also, that it is a way of increasing autonomy. So I'll be taking you through some reflections of the day with those thoughts in mind. But in particular, I just wanted to draw attention to what I would say today was really trying to think about and give emphasis to was an attempt to balance experience, outcomes, and knowledge. And I wouldn't suggest that that's a hierarchical matter, but something these three are the main points that today's symposium expertly tried to balance. So, of course, just to add more meat to the bones of that point, I guess what I'm saying is teaching and learning experiences, pedagogy and relationalities to think about. experience, learning outcomes and competencies, and that's something that I'm particularly interested in, thinking about how disability makes us understand, and of course, artificial intelligence, how does that make us understand what competency means? And knowledge, I would suggest, really significant here as well, in terms of thinking about who is able to access knowledge and who's able to contribute and engage with that knowledge in so doing. So, just to find my place again, sorry, there's an aspect of reading Braille very quickly. So as I mentioned, accessibility is something that is framed, I think, quite erroneously in what it is that we try to achieve. And I wrote a paper that was published, and I put it as the first one in the list that I pasted. I hope that worked in the chat, about how assistive technology and accessibility has clearly advanced, and there's thousands of pounds of technology around me that makes things more accessible, yet at the same time it doesn't. And there have been quite a number of discussions lately in disability studies about how accessibility is a continual negotiation, and it's a significant aspect of our professional and personal lives. That's something that we always have to engage with. It forms part of our identity for those of us who have to use it. And Desiree Valentine, the second citation I dropped into the chat there, writes about the emotional labor of disabled people trying to attain a base level of accessibility in order to achieve an outcome. But she is optimistic, and she writes something that I want to quote for you here. Accessibility can be expanded to include attention to some of the most fundamental elements of how we live, act, of our living, our acting, and our being. And I often go back and think about my use of JAWS, the screen reader, and Braille that provide me the opportunity to call myself an academic. So what do we hear from today? So I was really drawn to when in the first keynote, if you can think that far that back, where Sarah was talking about disability as a threshold concept. And here's something that really resonates with me, that if we're going to think about disability as an affirmative orientation, and disability studies helps us to do that, we need to reject ideas of sovereignty, of independence, of autonomy, because they favor an ableist assumption about what accessibility is actually achieving for us. Sarah also spoke really eloquently about the ideas of precarity, how accessibility can be really quite difficult to teach and perhaps to learn as well. And I would put it back that the argument here is that sadly it's the way that accessibility has been framed as that minority value point that only matters to those who really don't have it and those of us who are trying to teach it. Moving forward. Sorry, I just need to find my place again. So then we had a panel, and we're talking about researching accessibility in education. And this panel really brought home to me the idea of context and the significance of context when we're trying to undertake research. And we should definitely not try to decontextualize what it is that we're doing, because there's different resources, there's different competencies and different frameworks that we work with across the world, and depending where we are and who we are, that relate to accessibility research and teaching. Andy, of course, referred to, I guess, quite a dearth of research that he could find when he was talking about a literature review, that a lot of it is very about reflective work that is done on small scale levels. And perhaps it doesn't therefore reach the consequence that we might expect it to, based on the fact that it is still very niche. And so Andy, of course, put forward some ideas that they're using about sociocultural theories and the way they frame accessibility in particular ways when thinking about institutional engagements with that. And of course, I would urge on that front that if we can move away from the idea that accessibility is a reasonable adjustment for the individual and more of an institutional matter, that would be important. That's something that I had put in that first citation that I wrote to you, that I dropped into the box. Then we went to India and we heard from Swaroop, and that was a fascinating conversation about the lab, game-based learning approaches to accessibility. And this, of course, being set in the global south, where there are millions of software engineers, and it was quite fascinating to learn how few people learn about accessibility in their training in this important area, which again kind of points to the idea that context is key, and we need to make sure that these people can access the important information. They also, I mean, to turn this into a game-based response is quite engaging. Of course, it might refer to behaviorism to some extent and how people engage with the ideas of learning. But nevertheless, really important work to be done there. And I appreciate that. Thank you. We then went to Norway and we heard from Wekin Chen about regulations in Norway that are about digital design for systems, that there needs to be compliance with the regulations there, and when there's not compliance, and they'd use things like exams in the digital environments, that those ideas kind of frighten me a little. Thinking about, would you actually have access to these things? I think it's important to bear in mind that that this was set in Norway, where they rely very heavily on the Nordic social relational model of disability, which emphasizes participation and relationality to instill inclusive practices. And yet there was a distinct lack of understanding amongst faculty staff that she had surveyed and reviewed as well. And time, I was really curious to find that time was one of the things that prevented access. We then heard from Gianni and Kelly as well spoke, and was it Laura who spoke to the resources that JISC provides about making accessible resources available to people across the UK, which is really important, and thank you for upkeeping that sort of important work. Really interesting. We got a question from Mike at the time, who was talking about the significance of journals and how they might play a role in making sure that the content is that they receive is accessible. And I'd found a fascinating study in 2021 where only 2.4% of PDF documents that tend to be used to convey scientific information had been made accessible. 2.4% would seem right to my understanding. It is invariably PDF documents that we use are not accessible. I'm running out of time really quickly, so I'm going to race forward, and you'll be able to hear my screen reader in the background, I reckon. We then heard from another keynote from Jane, who spoke about ableism in relation to accessibility. And the points I think that we can take home from Jane is ones that I'm making myself, that knowledge can carry particular power, values, and can be used to favour one party over another. Perhaps accessibility goes missing in those sorts of discussions. And needs to be addressed. And I took home from Jane's keynote that making sure that decisions are made that are justifiable at every step about co-production and co-creation is really important. I'd also point out that Jane's slides were incredibly accessible with fabulous alt text, which was great. So thank you. Very quickly on the next panel. We heard about Vispero and I guess non-profit organisations and businesses that engage with disability, with accessibility, and also some fabulous work that Jade was presenting there at the Open University, and of course Anna over there in Spain at Carlos Tres with robots and the sorts of work that they're doing to try and create more accessible environments. This panel was really focused on relationalities, as I read things, thinking about how people interact with one another, how organizations interact with one another, and how people interact with robots to produce accessible knowledge. Very quickly onto the third panel. The key theme here, I felt, was resourcing accessibility knowledge. And significant to that was I was taken really by Rolando's reference to the historical frameworks that come before us. We're not trying to create new knowledge without thinking about what came ahead of us and how we got to where we are today. And to Tom's discussion as well with Sarah. Again, Tom put some really significant points to us about thinking about what do we want people to learn in relation to digital curriculum? What is a digital skill? And how could we promote equitable understanding and use of AI? Big questions, yeah? And the question there, of course, where do you start? But Tom did give us an idea about research, I think, and resourcing innovation, and the significance of that interface between research, policy, and practice. And what that really spoke to me really quite loudly was that large-scale research that involves these all different levels, which invariably must include the experiences of disabled people in so doing, in order to push the accessibility agenda along. In conclusion, accessibility. We have to acknowledge that it is something that is made, but as is inaccessibility. This is not something that comes about by accident, and power relations tend to stand in the way of accessibility being something that is taken up more, I guess, broadly or universally, if you like. The contributors today have explained how they frame their approach to addressing this, and in many cases this was to go beyond sitting back and waiting for policies and laws and training, but to provide another way, because just trying to rely on the approaches that we have in front of us today would be to continue a very individualist and accommodationalist approach to making sure accessibility is something that we can embed to something that we understand affects all of us. I'll finish up by simply saying congratulations to all the speakers today, and especially my congratulations to Sarah and everyone who has organised today's event. It's been fascinating, and I hope you've all enjoyed it as well. Thank you. Pass it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ben.